Hello, welcome to this video. As you can see, what we're going to be talking about is biodiversity, and we're going to then start talking about adaptations. So, by this point, you've hopefully already watched the wee David Attenborough clip on biodiversity, and so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail there and then leave you some research and questions to answer yourself. So, let's start talking about what biodiversity actually is. We should already have a good idea of this from the video, but basically, biodiversity is the variety, the diverseness of life all around us. And we can think of it in three main ways. So first off, and the most obvious, is the whole range of living things around us, from tiny bacteria and microorganisms, all the way up to whales and massive trees and everything in between. The second way of thinking of it is all the places these things live, all the different habitats and environments they live in. That's also an important part of biodiversity. Remember, the last part's a little bit more complicated, and that's something we think of as genetic diversity. And it's all the different characteristics and genes within these different organisms. So there's these three main parts that build up and make a full biodiverse environment and world to live in, and it is hugely important for us living on Earth. We couldn't exist how we do without it, and for plants and animals living on Earth also. Sorry, could have paused there. I don't know why I didn't. So take, for example, I maybe need some medicine for the cough I seem to have. A lot of those parts of that medicine would come from natural things growing in the world. Now, they couldn't grow if there wasn't insects to pollinate them, and then they also couldn't grow if there wasn't animals living within the soil, making the soil suitable for the plants to grow. They might not be able to grow without other plants nearby influencing them, so that's why biodiversity is essential to the world. So, when you have a look at these slides, I want you to answer these two questions. I want you to answer, why is biodiversity important to humans, and why is it important to animals and plants? So I've given you a wee clue, but you can do some research of your own, watch some other videos, and then just answer them on this slide you have where the red things are. Now, as well as biodiversity, we want to talk about adaptations. Now, adaptations come about because the world is full of all these different places. There's so many different environments and conditions on Earth, and animals and plants live in all of them, and so they've adapted to live in them. And so their behaviours might have changed, their bodies might have changed, so that they can be successful and survive in these different habitats and locations. And so what we want to focus on here is the ways in which they've adapted and what that means for them. So we're going to look at two animals, and then I'm going to let you do some yourself. So first off, let's start with polar bears, because they're great. So there we go, some lovely polar bears. Now, we know about them, we've got thick fur, they're in the snowy, cold places, but how have they adapted to that? And so there's a lot of different ways. So first off, their white fur, it matches their surroundings, it's camouflaged. Obviously, the giant big ones don't need it so much, but young polar bears still need protected from other predators, so they need to blend in and hide. They've got their really thick fur. Obviously, it's very cold where they are, and they need it to keep warm, but also their fur is really greasy, and so that means when they go into the water hunting or traveling, it doesn't absorb very much of the water, and it stays quite dry. So when they get out, they can dry off quickly and don't get too cold. Also, underneath this fur, they've got a really thick layer of fat called blubber, so like whales and seals and things have. This helps insulate them, helps keep them warm, but also, if they're struggling to find food, they can also use that fat for energy and keep going a little bit longer. They've got other things like their teeny tiny ears. I mean, they're not losing a lot of heat because, surprisingly actually, the ears on animals are one of the areas in which you can lose a lot of heat, but they have small ears so they don't lose a lot. And then the last one we're going to talk about with them is their massive feet. So they've got really big feet, and that means their weight spreads out a lot. So that stops them sinking through thin ice or deep snow, and so they can travel about easier. So this is just a handful of the ways in which they've adapted to suit their environment and survive in it. Now, let's look at something which is in a completely different environment, pretty much the opposite habitat, and that is camels. So we've got a picture here, less cute, I would say, but I don't know, some people like them. And so, camels generally are living in really, really hot areas, though they do still get cold at night, so that's why they do still have the fur. And they've adapted, sometimes in similar ways, but sometimes in very different ways. So to start off with, they've got a colour of fur which matches their environment, just like the bears did, and it helps protect it from predators. But you'll see it's really furry on the top. Underneath, they're normally very bald, are camels, and so that means they can sweat easily and lose a lot of heat there. So whereas the polar bears wanted to keep all the heat in, the camels want to lose a lot of it so they can keep cool in this hot environment. And then in their humps, they store fat, just like the polar bears have it all around them. They just store it in the hump or the humps above them, so it doesn't keep them too warm, but they can use it for energy and food if they need to. Then, just like the polar bears, they also have big feet, but they actually have sort of webbing between their toes, so it spreads the weight out even more, because quite often there's really soft sand that they might sink in otherwise. It also allows them to travel really fast because they don't sink at all into the sand. Then, another thing, to help them save water, because obviously water is something they struggle to find in the desert, they produce tiny, tiny amounts of urine, because they don't want to waste any of the liquid inside them. And then the last one we're going to talk about with them is they have really, really long eyelashes. And so it basically looks like they wouldn't be able to see out of them, but they can. And those really long eyelashes are there to stop sand getting in their eyes. Quite often there's sandstorms and windstorms out in the desert, and they need protection from that. So again, this is just a few ways they've adapted, but they've adapted to their environment. If you stuck a polar bear in the desert, it would not go well for it. It would overheat, it would stick out. If you stuck a camel in the Arctic, again, it would not do well. It would freeze to death because it's got no fat all around it, and it is again not camouflage for that environment. So they adapt to where they live. And so what I want you to do then is do something similar. I want you to think of 3 different animals, put a lovely picture of them there, and think of at least 3 ways, look up, research, at least 3 different ways they've adapted to their environment, and then complete your version of this slides for me. Right, that's your task for this bit of work, so I hope that was all understandable, and thank you for watching.